The U.S. Army sergeant almost turned the old man away that night. Then her K9 sat down beside his boots and refused to move. Some doors open because we choose to open them. Others open because something in us already knows. Like and subscribe to follow the full story. The last week of December 2023 brought a storm to Pine Hollow, Montana, that locals would talk about for years. Snow fell sideways across the valley, burying fence posts and turning the dirt road outside Sarah Whitman's farm into a white scar cutting through the wilderness. Sarah, 37, a former Army sergeant who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, was nailing a loose plank back onto the barn roof when she felt the wind cut clean through her jacket. Her left leg ached the way it always did in cold weather, a reminder of a helmet ambush back in 2018 that had ended her career and, eventually, her marriage. Beside her, Ranger lifted his head. The 7-year-old Belgian Malinois, a retired K9 explosives detector who had served alongside her, didn't bark. He simply stood, ears forward, eyes locked on something at the edge of the property. Sarah followed his gaze and saw a thin figure leaning against the gatepost, a man in a faded blue wool coat, both gloved hands wrapped around the wood for balance. A leather satchel rested at his boots. He looked old enough to have grandchildren and tired enough to have come a long way to find her. Behind him, a battered pickup truck sat half buried in snow at the bend of the road, its hood still ticking with cooling heat, abandoned, she would later learn, after the engine had given out 2 miles back. Sarah climbed down slowly. The man's voice trembled, but his words were steady. "Ma'am, I can fix watches, locks, anything broken. I just need somewhere out of this cold tonight." Sarah opened her mouth to refuse. Then Ranger walked past her, crossed the yard, and sat down beside the stranger's wet boots, pressing his nose against the old man's knee. In 5 years, Sarah had never seen him do that for anyone. His name was Walter Hayes, 78, and he settled into the small back room behind Sarah's kitchen as if he had been heading there his whole life. He rose before sunrise, kept the kitchen spotless, and never left anything out of place. From his satchel, he produced a small leather-bound notebook, a watchmaker's kit wrapped in oiled cloth, and a single black and white photograph he kept tucked inside his coat pocket where Sarah couldn't see it. On the second evening, she watched him examine her father's old wristwatch, the one that hadn't ticked since 2018. Walter held it under the kitchen lamp, his Parkinson's tremor easing the way it sometimes did when his hands found work they'd had known for 50 years. And 4 hours later, the soft, even sound of a moving second hand filled the room. Sarah sat at the table and didn't move for a long time. She hadn't realized how much silence she had been living in. Walter began teaching her chess after dinner. He laughed quietly when she made impatient moves. "You attack like a soldier," he said, "but chess rewards the one who waits." That night, for the first time since Kandahar, Sarah slept 6 straight hours without dreaming of the road, the smoke, or the friends she hadn't saved. On the 4th morning, she found him standing in the doorway of her barn, staring at a small wooden cart in the corner. His voice was barely audible. "I built this in the spring of 1985. Sarah froze. Her adoptive father had said that cart was a gift from a good man when she was a baby. Walter turned over the watch he had repaired and showed her tiny letters etched into the brass back. For EM 1986. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't name. Sarah began watching Walter the way she used to watch unfamiliar terrain through a rifle scope, looking not for danger, but for patterns. He knew too much. He knew Sleeping Bear Ridge by name. He knew the old oak at the tree line had been split by lightning decades ago. He knew which window in her house leaked when the wind blew from the north. When she asked how, he only smiled and tapped his temple. "Old men get their memories tangled, dear. Don't mind me." But one evening over chess, he mentioned a former student of his from decades ago, a brown-haired boy with gray-blue eyes who had been brilliant at math and who came to school with bruises on his arms that the teachers pretended not to see. Sarah's hand stopped over the chessboard. That description fit her adoptive father exactly. The next morning, while Walter worked in the kitchen, she opened her laptop and searched his name. Walter Hayes had taught mathematics at Cedar Falls High in Bismarck, North Dakota, from 1972 until 2003. Her father had attended Cedar Falls High. She felt the floor tilt very slightly under her feet. That afternoon, she climbed into the attic and pulled out the old oak desk that had belonged to her father, the one she had never been able to bring herself to open after his funeral. In the bottom drawer, beneath unpaid 1990 bills and an expired passport, she found a sealed envelope addressed to Walter Hayes, 412 Birch Street, Bismarck, ND. The postmark was 1986. It had never been mailed. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was her father's. "If anything ever happens to me and Linda, please look after the girl. You're the only one I trust." The black Range Rover came up the road 3 days later, churning through melting snow. With the slow confidence of money, Sarah watched from the porch as two people stepped out. The man wore a charcoal Burberry coat and the kind of haircut that cost more than her monthly grocery bill. The woman beside him was tall and severe in a black wool suit, a leather briefcase against her hip. Walter stood up from his chair on the porch very slowly. Sarah saw his jaw tighten. "That's Marcus," he said quietly. "My wife's son." Marcus Hayes, 48, smiled the practiced smile of a Denver real estate broker who closed deals on people's grandparents. He introduced his attorney, Vivian Cole, and produced a folder of papers stamped by a Colorado probate court. "Dad walked out of an assisted living facility 2 weeks ago," Marcus said, his voice warm with manufactured concern. "He's been diagnosed with Parkinson's-related cognitive decline. I have temporary guardianship. Thank you for keeping him safe, ma'am, but he needs to come home." Ranger placed himself between Walter and Marcus and produced a low rolling growl from somewhere deep in his chest, the exact sound Sarah had heard him make in Helmand the moments before things went wrong. Walter looked his stepson dead in the eye. "I'm not going back, Marcus, and we both know why you came." Marcus's polished smile slipped for less than a second. Before he climbed back into the Rover, he took out his phone and photographed the front of Sarah's house and the barn, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second on the silver bracelet at Sarah's right wrist before he pretended he hadn't seen it. Ranger snarled until the taillights disappeared. Sarah understood. This was not over. That night, Walter sat by the wood stove and finally began to tell her. His wife, Margaret, had died of pancreatic cancer in October 2021. Margaret had owned 320 acres of dry rolling land in rural North Dakota, emotional people, inherited from her grandparents, land everyone considered worthless till a survey crew from a mining company had come through 18 months ago. The soil contained heavy concentrations of neodymium and dysprosium, rare earth elements suddenly in desperate demand for electric vehicle motors and defense systems. Preliminary surveys placed the recoverable mineral value at roughly $45 million over the life of the deposit, with Marcus already in talks to flip the extraction rights to an overseas consortium for an upfront payment. Margaret's will refused. The land was to be held in trust for her youngest daughter, a child named Emily Margaret, born in 1986, who, according to all official records, had died at age 2 in 1988. Walter had only learned about Emily at all when he married Margaret in 1995, and even then, Margaret had spoken of the child only once, weeping at the kitchen table. But on her deathbed in 2021, holding Walter's hand, she had whispered something that changed everything. She didn't die. They took her. Sarah felt her chest go still. Walter reached into his coat with shaking fingers and pulled out the black and white photograph he had been carrying since this day he arrived. He laid it on the table in front of her. A younger Margaret stood in a kitchen, holding a small, dark-haired girl about 2 years old on her hip. The little girl was laughing, and on her tiny wrist hung a silver bracelet with 2 engraved letters facing the camera. Sarah looked down at her own wrist, at the bracelet she had worn every day of her life, and could not speak. Sarah didn't cry. She wanted to, but the soldier in her had been trained out of crying, and the rest of her was too stunned to find the way back. Walter spoke softly, as if afraid of breaking her. He explained what Margaret had confessed in her final weeks. In 1986, Margaret had been a young widow, or so everyone believed. Her first husband, a man named Frank Doyle, had supposedly died in a single-car crash on a back road in Wyoming. He hadn't. Frank had faked his death to escape federal charges for smuggling and tax fraud, and he had been living quietly under another name in Nevada ever since. He had also been a violent man, and his 10-year-old son, Marcus, had inherited that violence early. When Margaret had a daughter, Emily by another man, Frank had returned in secret and threatened to kill the baby unless Margaret made her disappear. Frank, while a silent Marcus watched and learned, had forged a death certificate and handed Emily to a man named Daniel Whitman, a former student of Walter's, who had agreed to take the child to Montana under a different name. Sarah listened to the story of her own life as if it belonged to someone else. The unmailed letter, then, was not Walter's. It was her adoptive father's emotional people, written the day he received her, addressed to the one teacher he had ever trusted in case the secret ever caught up to them. Daniel had sealed it the day he received the baby, but never mailed it. Convinced any paper trail back to Walter could one day be traced by Frank, he kept it locked in his desk as a last resort confession, to be opened only if he and Linda died before Sarah was grown. Walter had only pieced any of this together after Margaret died, and he had spent nearly 2 years quietly searching for Emily. He had hired a private investigator who traced Daniel Whitman's old Bismarck address to a forwarding record in Montana, then cross-checked county adoption registries and military enlistment photos, until a young recruit named Sarah Whitman, born in 1986, matched both the timeline and a faded image of the silver bracelet Margaret had described. Sarah looked at the old man across the table and understood, for the first time, that he had come for her. Marcus came back on a Tuesday, this time with reinforcements. Vivian Cole again, but also Sheriff Tom Reeves from Pine Hollow, and a woman named Eleanor Briggs from Adult Protective Services out of Helena. The sheriff looked uncomfortable. Eleanor looked careful. Marcus did most of the talking, his voice now sharpened by frustration. He produced a psychiatric evaluation declaring Walter incompetent and threatened Sarah with charges of unlawful detention of a vulnerable adult. Vivian Cole leaned in and reminded Sarah, with a thin smile, that as a potential heir to disputed property, she had a clear conflict of interest in housing Walter. Eleanor Briggs ignored both of them. She sat down with Walter at the kitchen table and asked him quiet questions: the date, the president, what he'd eaten for breakfast. Then a long multiplication problem. Walter answered every question correctly, his voice steady. Eleanor took the psychiatric report from Vivian, read it slowly, then looked up. "This is signed by Dr. Lawrence Bell." She paused. Dr. Bell's license was revoked in Colorado in 2022 for falsifying evaluations. "I'll need to flag this with the court before any guardianship transfer can move forward." Vivian's face went the color of paper. Marcus turned toward Walter, his polite mask gone, and took a step forward. Ranger moved faster than any of them. He launched between Marcus and the old man with a snarl that filled the room, and Marcus stumbled backward against the kitchen counter. His coat fell open. Sarah saw the black grip of a handgun tucked into his waistband, the kind of mistake a man makes when he has stopped sleeping, when the deal of his life is slipping away in front of a sheriff he had not expected to be standing there. Sheriff Reeves's hand went immediately to his own weapon. "On the floor, Mr. Hayes. Now." Running his record on the spot through the cruiser's dispatch, Reeves found a restraining order Marcus's ex-wife had filed in Colorado that he had never mentioned to anyone. The weeks that followed felt to Sarah like climbing a mountain in fog. Every step solid, but the destination unseen. A Pine Hollow attorney named David Park took the case pro bono after hearing the first 10 minutes of it. DNA testing confirmed what the silver bracelet had already whispered. Sarah was Margaret Hayes' biological daughter. Forensic accountants uncovered a trust fund of $3.2 million Margaret had set aside in Emily's name back in 1995. Money Marcus had been steadily bleeding through shell companies in Wyoming and Delaware for nearly a decade. Records showed Marcus had hired private investigators to track Walter, and, more recently, Sarah, for almost 3 months. One evening, when the paperwork had grown too thick to look at any longer, Walter sat down beside her with a tremor in his hands worse than usual. He told her the truth he had been holding back. His Parkinson's was further along than he had admitted. His neurologist had given him 2, perhaps 3 years before he would lose the ability to live independently. He hadn't wanted Sarah to feel obligated, he said. She didn't know how to answer, so she put her hand over his and held it until the shaking stopped. That same night, he gave her the leather-bound notebook. She opened it, expecting a journal. Instead, she found 396 letters, copied carefully in Walter's neat schoolteacher handwriting. They were Margaret's letters, written one each month for 33 years, to a daughter she believed she would never see again. Sarah read until dawn. She read about her own birthdays. Margaret had marked from a distance. Her high school graduation, Margaret had watched from a parked car. And the day she enlisted in 2008, when Margaret had wept for a week. The trial began in Bismarck, North Dakota, in March of 2024, where the trust had been registered and where the bulk of the financial crimes against Margaret's estate had been routed. Colorado prosecutors filed parallel charges on the forged guardianship and the firearms violation to be tried after the North Dakota proceedings concluded. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, and smelled faintly of old paper. Marcus Hayes sat at the defense table in a suit that no longer fit him quite right, charged with forgery, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, theft from a trust, and illegal possession of a firearm under a restraining order. Walter testified on the second day. He spoke slowly because his hands were shaking, but his voice never broke. He described the 2 years he had spent searching for a girl he had never met, working from a dying woman's last whispered confession and a single old photograph. Sarah sat in the first row and held the bracelet on her wrist with her other hand. When Walter described arriving at her gate in the snow, she finally cried, quietly, the way soldiers cry. He looked at her from the witness stand and added one detail he had never told her. Margaret had seen her once, by accident. In May of 2008, in the Denver airport, Margaret had recognized the silver bracelet on a young recruit waiting for a flight to Fort Benning. Too afraid that Frank or Marcus would harm the girl if she ever made contact, Margaret had sat down beside her under the pretext of small talk and could not bring herself to leave. They had talked for almost 4 hours. The recruit had spoken about her mother who had died, her father who was proud of her, and her fear of leaving home. The woman in the blue coat had gone home and not stopped crying for 7 days. Sarah did not remember every word, but she remembered the woman, the blue coat, the careful questions, the way the stranger had cried a little when Sarah talked about her father, and how Sarah had wondered for years afterward why a woman she would never see again had seemed to care so much. Then on the third day of trial, Vivian Cole walked into the prosecutor's office and confessed. Marcus had threatened her daughter, and Vivian had spent 6 months quietly gathering evidence while she arranged for her daughter to be moved out of state with a federal protective detail. The moment the girl was confirmed safe that morning, Vivian handed over a sealed flash drive of recordings, emails, and falsified documents she had kept in a safe deposit box for this day. When the dust settled and the verdicts came down, Sarah refused the $45 million mineral rights entirely. She kept only the $3.2 million her mother had set aside for her, and she used it to build something she could not yet name. She established the Margaret Hayes Foundation for orphan children and veterans living with PTSD. The North Dakota land was placed in a conservation trust, the rare earth left untouched in the ground. Walter moved permanently into the back room of her farmhouse. He fixed watches for the people of Pine Hollow and taught free math tutoring on Saturday mornings. Sarah built 2 small cabins on her property and called the place the Hollow Sanctuary. The first man through the gate was James Caldwell, 34, a former Marine from Wyoming who had lost a leg in Iraq, his wife, and most of his nights to drinking. He did not speak for 8 days. On the 9th, he sat down across from Walter at the chess table, and Walter said only, "I'll teach you a move I taught her father in 1985. Rachel Kim, a young local veterinarian, began coming out to care for the working dogs that arrived with the men. She and Sarah became close friends. Ranger was diagnosed with bone cancer that summer, but lived 18 more months on a treatment the foundation funded, long enough to see 6 veterans find their footing. Walter died quietly in the winter of 2026, 3 years to the week from the night he had appeared at her gate. In his will, he left Sarah a wooden box containing her original birth certificate, listing a father she had never heard of, a young photographer named Thomas Riley, who had been Margaret's true love, and whom Frank Doyle had murdered in a staged hunting accident months before Sarah was born. It was the reason Frank had hated the child, and the reason Marcus, raised on his father's grudges, had hated her too. In the spring of 2027, An 8-year-old girl in a too large coat appeared at Sarah's gate beside a tired social worker, holding a folded note in Walter's trembling handwriting. If anyone is lost, come to Pine Hollow. Sarah will help. Ranger Jr., a young Malinois from the same kennel that had bred Ranger, named in his memory, crossed the yard and sat down beside the child's wet boots exactly the way the old dog had once sat beside an old man's. Sarah opened the gate. If this story moved you in any way, please leave a like and subscribe to help us keep telling stories like this one. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and which moment stayed with you the longest.
Some of the most important roles in our life are not owned by strangers, they are owned by us. In moments when kindness feels inconvenient and truth feels dangerous, Sarah almost turned an old man away in a police. Had she done so, she would have lost not just a wish, but her arm was the last word. Her father hidden through and the family she never knew she had. These stories remind us that we will not looking up our guests are rarely just who they appear to be. Behind every tired year's history, behind every act of compassion, your reaction we cannot yet see. The old man Sarah welcomed did not just drink or was my cookies. He brought her name back to her. It's also teacher to listen to those who love us with us world. Ranger, the silent canine, knew before Sarah that so often in line our instinct and the quiet one around us. See the truth long before our mind catch up. And finally, this story whispered something every veteran, every brother soul, every lonely heart need to hear. Hearing rarely come through the door we set. Sometimes it walks up to us in a face blue cloud. Ask for shelter for the crow and quietly become the family we spend a lifetime searching for. Often the lips you never know who is coming home.